Welcome, everyone, to the Arkham Sessions. I'm Brian Ward.
I'm Dr. Andrea Letamendi.
Andrea, we're on episode 12.
We are.
So far, we've met Man-Bat, the Joker, a few times. Scarecrow, Poison Ivy, Two-Face. We've talked about everything from antisocial personality disorder and borderline disorder to dissociative identity disorder. We've talked about memories and how reliable they are. We've talked about what it means to lose those memories altogether. How do you feel so far? Do you feel like we've about covered it all?
Well, no. I mean, I know that we've covered quite a bit in the last 11 episodes, but we've only scratched the surface when it comes to psychology. Certainly there's a lot more we can talk about in terms of psychological disorders, psychological processes, and certainly about the characters and stories of Batman the Animated Series. Yeah, we've got a lot to talk about.
I agree. And this week, while we're not focusing on some supervillain, we are focusing on trauma and what kinds of effects that trauma could have on different people. This episode is called It's Never Too Late, and it first aired on September 10th, 1992. It was written by Garen Wolfe from a story by Tom Ruegger, and the episode was directed by Boyd Kirkland. We open on a couple of kids playing in the street, and we see that while they're willing to play outside the house, they really are uneasy around the estate of mob boss Arnold Stromwell. He's the elder mob boss who's basically been running the Gotham underworld up to this point. But we hear on the news that there's a gang war a-brewing between Stromwell and our old friend Rupert Thorne.
Right. Rupert Thorne is essentially the guy who's responsible for Harvey Dent's transformation into Two-Face.
Right.
Harvey! No!
Harvey! No!
Harvey! No!
Harvey! Wherever you are, I'm thinking about you. Yeah, I think he says that. He's in bed and that's what he says.
That was the best episode for Batman quotes. Are you dreaming tonight? Are they good dreams? Or are they bad dreams? Or both? In a world.
No, too soon.
Oh, it's too soon. And B, we hear that Stromwell's son Joseph has been missing for a few days.
Mm-hmm.
This war has to stop. I want a meeting with Thorne, and I want it tonight.
Thorne agrees, so the two guys basically agree to meet up at a restaurant where Bruce Wayne, disguised as a drunk hobo, has planted a listening device. And on his way over to the meeting with his rival, we sort of get a little peek inside Stromwell's current state of mind.
Right. So on his way to meet Rupert, he's in his vehicle. He approaches a railroad track, and the railroad crossing signal essentially goes off to signal that a train's coming. So when he sees the signal, he kind of goes into this trance, or he gets goes into this kind of panic. And what we realize is that it's reminding him of something in his childhood, and he experiences this flashback. Now, in this flashback, he and another young boy, looks like maybe they're about 9 or 10 years old, are playing on the train tracks, and a train comes while he's still on the tracks. His friend manages to move away from the tracks, but little Arnie is stuck on the track. His foot is caught in between the tracks. He's terrified because this train is approaching. Luckily, he gets his foot out just in the nick of time. The train, goes by. He's just in shock as he turns around. Another train approaches.
Right. And
that's essentially the flashback that he has.
So is that realistic? The sitting at a train stop and seeing the signal and immediately going into this panic attack mode?
Well, it's not unrealistic for a visual cue to trigger a memory, especially a traumatic memory. Memories can be triggered by cues that are perceived by any one of the 5 senses, or a number of the different senses. So, for instance, something that you hear that reminds you of something traumatic that would be an auditory cue. Something that you smell or taste could be olfactory or gustatory cues having to do with the memory of a traumatic event, for instance.
Okay.
And interestingly, the neural pathways in your brain that are connecting those smells and tastes to those memories are incredibly strong. So if you think about, like, what's something that you might smell or taste or hear as an adult that reminds you of something very vividly in childhood?
Interesting. I guess anytime I smell smoke from firewood, I think back to camping trips in the Boy Scouts.
Right. And they usually are like vivid memories of those experiences. Would you say that it really takes you back?
I don't really get vivid memories of them, but I can feel, like, I sort of feel the experience again. Like I remember the smell. And even though I've smelled firewood since then, I don't think about it any other times that I've ever smelled firewood. I just always think about, campfire.
Yeah. And if those experiences were traumatic, like let's say there was a traumatic experience for you.
It was the Boy Scouts.
Well, it could have been traumatic. So not surprisingly, when Stromwell is, passing through town and either hears a train or sees the crossing signal or, sees the lights going, he's going to have flashbacks. He's going to remember this traumatic event. And I think for this episode, this is really telling us that traumatic event is important in some way. It kind of starts out letting us know that he's frozen in that moment. He's really panicked, and he's somehow drawing back to the memory of playing with this other child and nearly being killed by this train.
We also see that Stromwell, from the very beginning, wasn't necessarily a good kid.
You gotta swear you won't squeal on me, Mike. Gee, Arnie, you keep stealing junk, you're gonna get caught. Nah, someday I'm gonna own this town.
He ends up coming out of his memory and going to this meeting with Thorne. And at this meeting, Stromwell accuses Thorne of kidnapping his son.
You'd do anything to take over my city.
I didn't touch your kid. I swear it on you. You know I don't mess with family.
And at the end of the meeting, Thorne basically tries to kill Stromwell by blowing the restaurant up. It's a very Godfather-like moment, except to the extreme. He's not just riddling the place with bullets. He's willing to blow up the restaurant. Batman, of course, steps in and rescues Stromwell just in time. And he makes it clear to Stromwell that he wants information on the two gangs.
Right.
Stromwell's a bit reluctant, so Batman takes him on a little tour, a la A Christmas Carol, where Batman basically plays the role of ghost of Stromwell's past and present. He takes him to the place where Stromwell first started his career, pushing drugs.
Prove it.
And now you manufacture them.
Prove that, too.
And then he takes him to the rehab facility nearby where his own son is lying there in bed with withdrawals from Stromwell's own drugs.
Joey.
Well, right. We get the sense that instead of being kidnapped or abducted, his son actually went into rehab for treatment of drug abuse.
Right.
I mean, it's kind of a heavy thing. Batman takes him into the room, and I guess it's his little Joey's. Well, Joseph is probably like a teenager or young adult, right?
Yeah.
I call him Joey. So Joey's in the bed, and his mother is there, and she said that she had just found out that he had been essentially hospitalized here or admitted to the drug rehab center, and she informed Stromwell that the doctors are saying, to let him rest. He needs to get through this, and Stromwell is pretty taken aback and surprised. Look at the effects of your drug ring and your organization. It's hitting home. It's impacting your son. It's potentially could be killing your son.
It has to stop, Stromwell. It has to stop.
And rather than understand that, Stromwell essentially says, we're going to take this kid out of the rehab center where he's going to get well on his own, and pretty much is in denial about the fact that he really is responsible for his son being there.
Batman then attempts to convince Stromwell to give him the information he needs, and Stromwell actually sort of makes him think he will. He takes him to an office, and he gives Batman a fake file. Of course, Thorne thinks it's all legit, so he unleashes his men, and the rest of the episode basically plays out with Stromwell trying to escape, Batman taking out each of Thorne's men one by one, and then Stromwell being confronted by his brother, who is a priest now. We learn that the other child in the memory is Stromwell's brother, and he has since grown up from this incident and has gone in the opposite extreme as his brother. He is now a priest.
Right.
And he shows up and basically also tries to confront his brother.
I came to help you, Arnie.
I don't need your help.
Is that a fact?
At the end of the episode, Stromwell ends up turning himself over to Commissioner Gordon, but only after we see the full extent of the memory.
It's interesting because at the end of the episode, we see, as you said, we see the entire event, the entire traumatic event that Stromwell and his brother experienced together. And it's really interesting.
We see that Stromwell, when he escapes the first train, ends up on the second set of tracks. His brother, Michael, pushes him off of those tracks and ends up getting hit by the train.
Right.
The result is he loses a leg.
Right.
However, he's still the half that ends up going down the better route later in life.
One can say that just looking at that information about this event, that the traumatic experience could potentially have been, if I might say, more traumatic for Father Michael because he actually lost a leg. So let me just first define what a trauma is, because I think a lot of times we use that word, right? Like we'll say, oh, being on the 405 was really traumatic. Or, I saw a really terrible movie that was so traumatic for me. And we're all kind of, we're using the word on a day-to-day basis, but really what a traumatic event is when defined by psychologists and psychiatrists is actually something very specific, and it's defined in the DSM, our Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. A trauma is defined as exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. That trauma can actually be experienced by a person firsthand, or one could be a witness and see it secondhand, and it still could be considered a trauma. So that's really how we define traumatic events.
So then let's talk a little bit about the differences in the paths down which these two guys go. Michael, who loses his leg in the incident, becomes a priest. Arnie, who is already a bit of a bad egg, eventually becomes Gotham's premier mob boss and drug manufacturer. But they both clearly have responses to this trauma on the train tracks, just
Right.
different responses.
Right. Well, one thing you want to think about in terms of responses to traumas is that certainly the way that we are before a trauma can kind of influence or shape how we are after a trauma. Does that make sense? So Stromwell already has these traits of being somewhat a young criminal. He's stealing candy.
Sure.
So he's sort of like the child's version of a criminal. He's
Right.
stealing candy. He seems to be on his path already to a lifestyle of crime, one can say.
And Michael is on his is on the path to being a priest.
Yeah, he's saying basically, I want nothing to do with that. You stole that candy. That's wrong. And so we want to be mindful that even prior to the accident, they have these certain traits and these certain values and lack of values, one can say. So after the accident, it's interesting that it's almost like their worldviews almost intensify, possibly, right? That Stromwell ends up growing up to be a mob boss. And as Batman is kind of taking him down, memory lane and reintroducing him to the places where he first enacted his crimes and started out dealing drugs and so forth, that you can tell that he had been involved in this criminal lifestyle for a long time. So on the other hand, his brother became a priest. So it's possible that there's something about his experience that lends to more compassion or lends to more hopefulness. He actually survived this. Now remember, his leg was destroyed from this train. So was there something about that accident that made him feel like he survived for a reason? Maybe he felt that he was left alive for a purpose. Maybe he turned to God and religion. Maybe he felt that he could save other people. That's kind of what I mean by someone's worldview changing because of a traumatic event.
And you've dealt with amputees in your line of work. Have you seen this wide range of patients, some who handle it much better and some who don't?
I do, absolutely. A lot of times somebody can lose a limb or be in an accident and have to have a limb amputated. And the responses vary. Some people recover quite quickly, both emotionally and physically. And we would consider that a normal recovery in that they begin to live a life of acceptance and one that they can, one that's adaptive with their new body, so to speak. Others, unfortunately, have a more difficult time transitioning and adapting to their injury or their loss of limb and can present with a lot of guilt, depression, anxiety, maybe PTSD. And a lot of times it has to do with what caused the injury. So if it was like an accident, being in a vehicle, car crash, something that was just, a natural disaster, something that was outside of our control, people who tend to have those accidents are more likely to recover in a healthy way. However, if someone's victimized, if they're assaulted, if they're, in combat and they have these types of injuries, they may be more likely to deal with some of those emotional responses that are quite challenging, like depression, PTSD, anxiety, substance abuse, and so forth.
Where does guilt play into all of this? Because as we can see, Father Michael has basically let go of of any sort of negative residual effects of having lost his leg, but Stromwell is paralyzed in fear when he comes up to the train tracks. So clearly he's got this guilt playing into it.
I think, what you're getting at with guilt is actually something that's been studied more recently when it comes to post-traumatic stress responses. So for anyone wondering whether Stromwell has post-traumatic stress disorder, let me quickly go over that criteria because I actually think that he doesn't. PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder is characterized by 4 different symptoms or clusters of symptoms. And this is actually a newer recognized version of PTSD. I'm referring to the DSM-5. So psychology nerds who are listening right now are realizing this is the newer version of the diagnostic manual, basically. And in this version, we have 4 symptoms or 4 clusters versus the 3 we had before. So very quickly, the symptoms or the symptom clusters for PTSD include re-experiencing the event, so having spontaneous memories of the traumatic event, like recurrent dreams, flashbacks. That's essentially what we're seeing with Stromwell, right? So keep that in mind. The other 3 major symptom clusters include heightened arousal, like aggression, reckless behavior, sleep disturbances, just kind of being on guard constantly. Avoidance, this would be trying to avoid the distressing memories, the thoughts, the feelings, the reminders of the event. And finally, negative thoughts and mood or feelings. These may be feelings like blaming others, estrangement from other people, a markedly diminished interest in activities, things like that.
We've seen this guy have the flashbacks. We haven't necessarily seen him avoid trains,
No.
but we have seen him. He has clearly become estranged from his brother. He avoids his brother. That relationship has sort of gone downhill. At one point, when Batman is recruiting Father Michael, Michael even says,
That's one soul I wish I could give up on.
so he certainly seems to fit a couple of these.
A couple, yes.
And he's also gone down the path of becoming a criminal. Now, no one could say necessarily that he wasn't already going down that path, but could this event have sort of sent him down that way?
It probably sent him down that way more intensely and more quickly, if one can say. We don't know what would have happened to him without this traumatic event. Maybe he would have just engaged in, kind of petty crimes, or maybe he would have just, with the help of his brother, done something a little bit more pro-social. But, one can probably, because he's having these flashbacks in adulthood, one can probably surmise that event was pretty crucial to, kind of shaping the person he is today. And I don't know that we have enough information to say for sure he has post-traumatic stress disorder. But what we can see is that, yes, he has these flashbacks. And his brother, who experienced the same traumatic event more or less, doesn't seem to have the same psychological, it didn't have the same impact on him. He doesn't seem to have those negative thoughts, the flashbacks, the avoidance, the hypervigilant or aggressive behavior. He seems like a healthy guy. He seems like he's adapted well.
Drea, I feel like this episode has a lot to say about the power of family, in that Batman actually shows Stromwell the effects of the drugs he produces, and yet nothing seems to persuade him until Father Michael steps in. In your profession, is there a value to family beyond anything else? Is blood really thicker than water?
It really depends, but for the most part, yes. I would say when there's a crisis, or when there is a strong need for change in behavior, like getting off of drugs or engaging in safer behaviors, we usually will try to recruit family members or involve family members in that change process, because those family members will be able to speak to some deeper level. They'll be able to connect and to find, hopefully, to instill some hope in a way that maybe a mental health professional can't. You can certainly instill that kind of change and hope without a family member, but it can certainly be helpful.
Okay, so let's go to the questions. On Twitter, Bernard O'Shea asks, the episode seems inspired by It's a Wonderful Life and Angels with Dirty Faces. I certainly get those references, although I also see more of A Christmas Carol for some reason. But although the theme remains relevant, the character values seem lifted from the 1940s. Batman also seems more like a guardian angel than the Dark Knight. Redemption is an eternal theme in fiction, but how do you think a story like this should be received by a modern-day secular generation? Does the episode seem preachy to you? Should our heroes forgive drug dealers? Do the themes of forgiveness and redemption contradict Batman's own values pertaining to justice? He's got some interesting thoughts.
Wow.
And,
Yeah. It's interesting that this episode happened after the Harvey Dent Two-Face two-parter, because I felt like Bruce Wayne, when we left that episode, Bruce Wayne was essentially giving us this message, or we were left with the message that it isn't too late for Harvey Dent either. And that Bruce Wayne was still hoping that Harvey would turn his life around.
Right.
And become the person, or go back to the person that he used to be. And it's interesting that this episode is called It's Never Too Late, and kind of has the same theme of redemption and of, I want to say, like, I keep using the word recovery, but I think that, if we think about mental health, that is really the theme that I'm seeing here. Recovery, getting better, yes, going through some hard times, but being able to, with the help of friends and with the help of family, being able to get healthy again and get right back on the good track. And for some reason, I didn't see this episode as very religious and preachy. I know the episode ended with a scene, I think, of the church and church bells. And that was a nice capstone to the end of this episode because of course, of Father Michael and this story about the two brothers. But I didn't see this as being preachy.
Yeah, Kyle Tonorella over at Twitter also asks, what are your thoughts on some of the religious aspects of this particular episode of Batman? And I like you, I don't know that it necessarily gets preachy. I don't think I don't think they're focusing on religion so much as they're focusing on the black and the white. They're focusing on the guy who went evil and the guy who went good. And they're just focusing on two separate extremes.
Well, and interestingly, while it focuses on the good and the bad, like the black and the white, it still addresses the blurriness and the gray areas that someone who does go bad or someone who does engage in bad behavior can actually be a good person again. And again, with mental health, we do look at, quote unquote bad behaviors as being the behavior. The person isn't bad. It's the actions they're taking, the behavior they're engaging in, the symptoms that they're suffering from. Those are what's negative. But the person isn't negative. The person isn't bad. And I think that this episode is very consistent with that mental health philosophy.
And I like that you brought up the fact that this came right on the heels of the Two-Face two-parter.
Right.
Both of which involve Rupert Thorne to a great degree. And Rupert Thorne basically being responsible for Harvey blowing up. And in this case, legitimately planting a bomb and trying to blow up Stromwell.
Yeah. Rupert could have created another Two-Face.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you brought up the fact that Batman sees this as an opportunity to redeem himself in that way, in that he wasn't able to get to Harvey in time. He was not able to help Harvey, but he is able to help Stromwell.
Yeah.
On one hand, this could be Batman learning from mistakes or learning from experiences and truly reaching out and helping. Or this could be Batman helping himself. I mean, it could be his own redemption, his own...
He wasn't going to feel better until he was able to save someone else.
Right.
And then he felt fulfilled. Like he felt like he was able to fulfill this role.
Yeah.
True. I mean, I think there's some truth to that as well.
As always, if you have questions for us about the episodes or anything else for that matter, you can find us on Twitter. We are at Arkham Sessions there. Drea, what's your personal Twitter address?
You can reach me at Arkham Asylum Doc. That's Arkham Asylum DOC.
And I'm at bward028. You should also be sure to like us on Facebook. Just look up the Arkham Sessions there, and you can ask questions, leave comments, and all that shazazz. Drea,
Cool.
any thoughts on any parting thoughts on this episode?
Well, there was some discussion about drug abuse and drug intervention or treatments, and so I just wanted to say, if anyone is interested in learning more about substance abuse and mental health treatments for problems with drugs and alcohol, there is a number they can call. It's the number for SAMHSA. SAMHSA is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. The number is 1-800-622-HELP. That's 1-800-622-4357. They also have a website, samhsa.gov. That's samhsa.gov. A lot of really important information there about drug and alcohol abuse and dependence. There's also the National Institute on Drug Abuse. That's www.nida.nih.gov. And for more things Batman, I actually want to invite folks to visit justgenrecipes.com. There's actually a fantastic Batman recipe right now on how to make Batman cookies. Again, it's justgenrecipes.com, JUSTJENN recipes.com. Jen is a good friend of mine, and she was very kind to not only bake some fantastic and yummy Batman cookies, but also to plug our podcast and talk a little bit about what we're doing with the podcast. So
Thanks, Jen.
yeah. Thank you, Jen.
And I want some cookies.
You shall have cookies.
Excellent. That wraps up this week. Tune in next week because I've got Batman in my basement.
You do?
That's actually the name of the episode.
Oh.
And it introduces us to the Penguin.
Finally.
Yes, so come back next week for that. Till then, I'm Brian Ward.
I'm Dr. Andrea Letamendi.
And we are
The Arkham Sessions.